Hello and welcome back to the We The Patriots Podcast. I'm your host, Andrew, along with my co-host, Sal, and we're going to build upon our last episode that we did for you guys about the media and how it's really dividing us, and we're going to go into some specifics in this episode and really look back into history and see where the media has kind of shifted people's thinking one way or another.
Talk about this thing that's in my brain. It keeps me from wanting to go on, but I want some gain. Maybe a little fame.
First and foremost, we were talking a little bit before the show. I think the best first example is to try to bring people into the recency bias, right? What people are really accustomed to. And the most obvious one, I think, more so than what's been going on with the NATO Ukraine thing, which I think we'll get into a little bit later. The most obvious one that people love to point to is the weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah.
Right. And I think it was actually even played, I think it's false to call it a lie in a way. How do you feel about it?
If you look on the surface, it does seem like a mispresentation.
Misrepresentation.
Yeah. Misrepresentation of the facts. Now, whether or not you want to call it a lie, it seems deceiving to me. But
I think you can understand why it's called a lie.
I do. No, I do.
Right. And
I think lie is a strong word. I think maybe there were some indications of maybe there being threats
right.
in the Middle East.
That's what I was pointing to.
Yeah. So that's why I don't know if I would want to call it an outright lie, but a mischaracterization, misrepresentation, sure, maybe. Especially after a point, absolutely.
Right. I think that's a bigger
Yeah.
thing too, is right. So you're starting to use it as a justification for engaging in the war.
When you do, for
Understood.
a fact, after a certain point, right? Like, it's one thing to
Right.
kind
That's
of
right.
know or to not know and then find that there's nothing there, but then still continue to use it as a justification. That's a lie.
And I think that's where most people have their problem with it. And I think it's got to be out in the open that,
Yeah.
Like I said, I don't necessarily see it as a lie, especially up front. When you're using justification for war, you have to realize that this is on the heels of 9/11.
Right.
Okay. And you can say that George Bush was warmongering. You could say that he wasn't. But a lot of what it has to do is certain people are going to hear what they want to hear,
Yeah.
I think, right? And when you get to leadership of that point, you're looking for other high authority staff that's very trustworthy to give you the information that you want to hear as well. So you don't just want to just go off of anything.
Right.
Once you start to hear allegations, against people like Saddam Hussein, who might have weapons of mass destruction hidden away in a country that we're not exactly that close to, right? Even though when we've been working with these governments and these people for decades prior, right? And that's where people really start to come up with the I think the concrete evidence that there's lies.
Right.
And that's where I tend to agree with him.
Yeah.
You had to have known the situation a lot better than you're leading on.
Right.
You put information that you know for a fact goes against what you feel at heart, and you put that to the wayside because you found other people to give you corroborating evidence to your side.
Right. Because we knew that prior to 9/11, we knew that there was the chance of an attack.
Absolutely.
So if we knew that, we had to have known more about weapons of mass destruction, one would think.
And if they existed.
Existed, whether or not they existed, sure.
And you could also, of course, make the claim that weapons of mass destruction might be inclusive, or at least it's, I don't know, how would you even term it? Like having gas storages, right? So gas that's meant to be used against the public, right? That might be considered a weapon of mass destruction, or if not, an intolerable weapon for a government to have, right? And you can make justifications based on that if you wanted to. Now, I think the evidence points to, specifically Saddam's regime not using that going into the 2000s, not really actually using that by the time that he actually totally crumbled. There was no evidence of any weapons of mass destruction, gas, or anything, but that's because he was powerless, in my opinion. But I think what it leads us into is that NATO conversation that we were talking about earlier. What people are, or at least in my opinion, I want your thoughts on this, what people are not really recognizing is that America's way of waging war has changed. It's not straight up, we're going to declare war on you, because you also need to get Congress involved at some point. You don't necessarily
For
need
an
it for
official
the initial
declaration.
strikes. Right, but for an official declaration, you need to get Congress involved. And what you don't need to get Congress involved is operations done by three-letter agencies, FBI, CIA.
Under the War Powers Act.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, how are these agencies working and how do they funnel money? Well, none of it's on the books, right? So a lot of this has to be laundered money. It could be totally for America's interest or not, but it's not on the books, so we'll never actually find out.
No.
Right? And this is the type of war that's been waged in the recent past by the United States. And you look at like Syria, you look at Ukraine in 2014, the overhaul of the government there. Okay. And these are all actually attacks on Russian interests. Right now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have claim to them, but it does mean that they have interest in these areas. And for us to be blatantly overthrowing regimes in these areas using coup d'etats, using different methods of subversion from the democratic point of view, well, does it make us any better than what communism used to be, right? And something that we'll talk into a little bit later with the Red Scare.
It's an interesting point. Yeah, and you can see, I guess, why from the Russian perspective, they might feel threatened by maybe not us directly, but indirectly with kind of how we've been involved.
Right. And I think the way and the instruments we're using, right? Like I said, like foreign money, aid via weapons, and coup d'etats. Like, what government wants a coup d'etat in your to happen in your country? It's non-existent. There is none. That's just the way that I feel about it, and that kind of at least puts a picture that is salable to the American public on how Putin may be feeling. Like I said, it doesn't justify anything that he does, and it doesn't.
We're not saying that. I want to be crystal clear.
I agree, and I never want to. And we'll be doing another episode later for those of you that are well aware that Putin did an interview with Tucker. We're going to talk about that totally separately. I think that warrants its own interview, and it had a lot of disinformation on both sides trying to get each other to capitulate on a point. Right. And there were some tough questions asked and answered in tough ways. There was didn't seem too much softballing going around, but with that comes a lot of material. I'm going to say that for its own episode. All right. But what the interview did do was provide a lot of basis for understanding of where Putin's at and possibly where the Russian public is at, where their feelings are. And it did throw a lot of shade at the CIA and America in general. And not unwarranted.
No.
Right? That stuff when he asked who blew up the pipeline. Right? And which is, this is something that I've heard that it is the biggest expulsion of CO2 ever. All right. So clearly the people that did it had no care in the world about the environment. What if it was us?
Right.
Right? Because there's only a certain amount of governments that had the power and the ability to do that. And not only that, like Putin was mentioning, he did say certain people actually have the intent or the reason to do so. And there's only a certain few. And Russia would be one of them, I guess you could say, in a way, but only if you look at it from a certain lens. A bigger profiteer of that would be shutting off their communication to the West or any sort of sales to the West and forcing either U.S. sales or U.S. allied sales to Europe.
Yeah, like some kind of economic sanction, which they already, are in place in many ways.
Russia is, and that was actually something that you said that was true, absolutely true, is Russia is the most sanctioned nation via economic trade in the world, and that is true.
Yeah. Probably for good reason, too, now.
Because, you could say so.
Yeah, but...
Absolutely.
It was an interesting interview, for sure. Watched every second
of it. I thought so, yeah. I think, like I said, we'll talk about it a little more, but it gave a lot of context, and also it explains that, to be honest, there is reason to fear NATO. If you're not in it, you're going to be persuaded and propagandized to get into it.
Right.
And if you don't, the pressures, the coups that may come your way, the revocation of aid, right? Making yourself basically an isolationist country.
Right.
You have no allies. That's a threat. It's a real threat that the allies in NATO, they impose heavily.
It is. Now that you say that. And you may just want to not necessarily be totally isolationist, but you may want to remain neutral. You might not want to engage in any sort of pact. which sometimes isn't the best idea if you look throughout the course of history.
Exactly.
Forming alliances isn't always a wise idea.
Correct.
So it kind of gets to a point too where, like, how valuable is this coalition of nations?
Right.
Is if how powerful is it if some of these countries are being forced in with a gun to their head? They don't want to be
Right.
in there.
If it's not, that is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. If
Yeah.
it is not a willing participation on both sides, what does that mean?
Yeah. What is it supposed to? Yeah. No.
I agree. I couldn't agree anymore. Actually, it is an absolute fact that there's no way you can hold a strong coalition if the coalition is battling in amongst themselves.
One-sided. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, or trying to.
Powerless, in my
Yeah,
opinion.
The whole NATO idea, it's of course brought about with World War II, but the idea goes back much further. It goes to the League of Nations, and it goes back even further to one world government talk, much, much further back, right? And a lot of it actually stems to when there was total loss of control in the Middle East, and nobody had control of Palestine and Israel. Nobody had control of these areas, and a lot of that stems to the overall control of how Britain was, how much control they had across the world, and then the American colonization of the world as well.
Right.
It's funny to see how much of our politics now is revolving around the poor decisions made in the early 1900s and mid 1900s. It's very interesting. And I think very much like, we'll get into the next topic soon, but I just want to get this one point off. Very much like at the end of World War I, when the Treaty of Versailles was made, but in the back of almost everyone who signed that document's mind, they knew another war was coming. They just had to stop it at the moment. I think that World War II, very similarly, they knew it, like, just like you see our war on terror in the Middle East,
Right.
you can't eradicate ideology.
No.
You can't do it.
No.
When you exterminate one, 5 more come.
Yeah.
Okay. You took out Nazi Germany, but what does that mean for the people that still feel ingrained to that feeling of that person had me captivated, or that ideology had me captivated?
Right. I mean, that's where social enforcement comes into play.
Mm-hmm.
Propaganda might play a role. Oh, this
Huge
is
role.
bad. This is bad, which it is. Obviously, we don't want Nazism, but the way to really eradicate an ideology is to shape people's minds, which is what propaganda is.
Correct. Yeah, and to influence them, and to, another thing too is, especially in America, right? Because people are going to find the information one way or another. I think a big thing is not shutting down in America, right? Other countries might be different, where you need to shut down the opposition otherwise.
Right.
But in America, I do believe genuinely that if you are not put forth all of the information right from the get-go, you're going to make a short-sighted decision, change your opinion again later in the future. And it's an ongoing cycle until you finally expose yourself to so much information you don't know what you feel.
Right.
All right. Now, I do think, in a way, that's a better method. That being said, giving all that information out from the get-go makes you make a more informed decision.
It does.
Right. And most of the time, when you have all the information on the out front, you'll never get 100%. But when you have more of it, you come a lot closer to the middle of things than you do to one side or the other, almost every time.
Yeah. It's a good way to, I guess, radical proof your society.
Right. I agree. You're going to live in the middle. The more that you try to say the other side is evil, the other side is good, or my side is good, your side is evil, the more you're going to throw away the garbage from your side, and you're going to highlight the garbage from the other side. Right. Whereas the good parts that everybody wants to see is only getting shown by that particular part.
Yeah, it becomes much more polarizing.
Mm-hmm.
Seems like.
I agree. I think that brings us back. I think we should go talk about Vietnam.
Yeah,
I think it's a pretty important. Why don't you take the lead on this one?
Well, when you ask a lot of people what the cause of the Vietnam War was, a lot of them don't even know.
That is true.
A lot of people genuinely don't know. They just know it was fighting in a jungle at blades of grass.
That is true. I would say that most people really genuinely think we went there as a warmongering nation and failed. That's what most people
Or that
think.
there was a legitimate threat to America's sovereignty, America's
Well, let's explain why. Why is that? What were we really fighting?
the spread of communism.
Not just necessarily the spread of Russian communism either, just
Communism.
Yeah.
Yep. But and
that's important to highlight.
And that's
important
my point. In saying that a lot of people don't understand or know the origins of the Vietnam War, because you would think with how prevalent it is in history, how much of a place it has in history, how many deaths there were, how much money was spent, how big of an event it really was, you would think that America was attacked. You would think that it was a retaliatory sort of ordeal. And with the fact that we were there for forever, you would think it was like a defensive reaction or that was turned offensive. No, it was a war to stop an ideology that a lot of people got behind for a long time.
It also led. Now, the Red Scare, correct me if I'm wrong, was not only right before, but also as the Vietnam War was happening.
As that was really heating up.
Right.
Yeah. Because we started sending money there in the 50s.
And if I'm not mistaken, JFK was actually in line with McCarthy. He was actually on board with a lot of the things that he was doing in order to eradicate communism from our ranks.
Right.
And it's interesting because the book that I was mentioning earlier, The Myth of the Left and Right, which for anybody who's interested, I highly suggest if you need a little bit of a injection of real politics in your life and not such partisan. But regardless, what they were mentioning is that McCarthyism actually did more work for communism than any of the communists in our government did whatsoever. Just because he decided to pick a stance so strong against an ideology, instead of promoting the good of his own, it was anti another. And I found that fascinating.
It is interesting how that works psychologically too.
Yeah, and the American way is to pick the underdog.
The underdog, exactly right. To kind of pick the side that you're told and programmed to hate. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting to say the least.
Yeah, but when you look at both of those instances, Vietnam and the Red Scare, and both of them have to coincide. Like I said, the years line up, but a lot of the politicians involved actually coincide with each other as well. And it really changed the American fabric, right? So a conservative became someone who was actually, in a way, supportive of what the idea behind the Vietnam War was, even though they weren't necessarily supportive of either the outcome or the strategies involved in achieving that outcome. Whereas liberal ended up supporting the side of the Vietnamese, for lack of a better term, but they also ended up siding with, liberalism really changed that.
That was, I think it was a big turning point.
Yeah, because no longer are you going to see another JFK. You're now only going to see very
progressive liberals.
Yes, but like I think we talked at some point, even like Bill Clinton was very right of our left-leaning politicians nowadays. It was just
supposedly, at least he was perceived that way.
That's what I wanted to talk about, the perception.
Yeah.
Right. So the perception started slipping after that moment.
After that moment
of Vietnam, where the perception of the right wing no longer was peace. It was actually
warmongering, and then the left was all about peace, love,
even though they weren't.
Yeah.
And you see that now, and that's kind of what brings us back into that Obama age of working behind the scenes. Yeah, we still are technically in the Afghanistan or Iraq war or what have you, but we're doing it behind the scenes. We're gonna start boosting regimes, and instead of being upfront war. And what I'm trying to get at is the fact that it is neither side is better for it. Neither side is better for committing an actual war. No side is better for committing a proxy war or for starting a coup. None of that should be the American way, in my opinion. Now, I think we did have one more topic to cover, and I think it would actually be a good ending point after we talk about it. So, what do we have left? Spanish American. That goes back. And there's a reason that I want to talk about it. It's because nobody actually to this moment knows if the event that kicked off Spanish-American War really was committed as an act of propaganda to start the war, if it was committed on behalf of the Cubans to start this revolution, or if it was an act committed by the actual Spanish in a total mistake to start the war with the Americans. Nobody knows to this day about the USS Maine. Nobody knows the truth. They just know that it blew up, a lot of Americans died, and it was used as a major reason for justification for the war declaration in Congress, even though there was no veracity to who did it.
That's an interesting one. Yeah. I mean, because we know sinking ships, and obviously people dying have been the cause
of American intervention.
Congress
Yeah.
accepting a war declaration on another country, right? World War I with the Lusitania, Spanish-American War now, and Pearl Harbor.
Well, that's another one too.
World War II.
Right. So how much of the American face during World War II was we are remaining neutral. This is another conflict. We're not letting it affect another generation of our boys. Blammo, we're attacked. We're in.
At that point, yeah.
We're in. It's not like we haven't been getting delegations to come in.
No.
All throughout the war. It just so happened that once we got attacked at Pearl Harbor.
Right.
Another instance of, we knew there was a chance of an attack, but did we really expect it like now? Did we really, like, it didn't make any sense for Japan to do what they did. However, if you're looking at it from an aspect of, I think, changing the American outlook, they succeeded. In what they did with Pearl Harbor, when you look at the decline in the ability of Americans to come together and fight an issue on whole, I think Japan succeeded in their attack. As much as in the short term, it
was the total opposite.
Well, it was also really detrimental to Americans too. Remember how many Americans died in the Asia Pacific part of World War II. Not many people like to talk about that.
In terms of being able to combine for a collective effort and work towards one goal of winning the war.
Agree. It was a mistake because they put Germany and Italy in a completely compromised position and actually just solidified the fact that the war was ending soon.
Yeah.
That being said, like I said, if you're Japan and you know the war is inevitably going to go against your favor, why wouldn't you pull a Pearl Harbor? That's what I mean, that the attack was actually effective.
Right.
And when you look at how strong Japanese culture is today, they are one of the most ideologically pure societies in the world. They do not have gun crime. Now, granted, a lot of that has to do with the demilitarization of the populace. I understand that, but they don't have attacks.
Right.
When you talk about like their crimes, it's like petty little robberies. It is an intensely different type of democracy.
It is. Yeah, it really is. And if it's funny because if you were to ask an older generation Japanese, I think they would, based on what I've read, I don't think that they would necessarily approve of their society nowadays because I think they would think that it's progressive. I read something somewhere in a book where there was like a Japanese soldier who was out on his own in the woods of like the Philippines or something for like 30 years after World War.
Multiple instances.
World War II.
That from Dan Carlin.
Yes.
Oh, Dan Carlin's the best. But yeah, so
and for 30 years he's like fighting, like shooting people off in the Philippines, and they're like, "Yo,
scavenging ammo."
Yeah, and we're like, "Yo, like, war's over, bud. Like, come out." And they're like, "Nah, it is just tactic."
You remember the way that they got him out though?
How?
They had to call in their superior officers from the war. They wouldn't respond to anybody except for someone who'd given them orders in the past, and that unbelievable.
Yeah.
Just the discipline and the inability to be affected by other speak, other propaganda.
People talking Japanese to them. Then when they went back to Japan, I remember reading how they expressed how disappointed they were in the progressive culture.
Mm-hmm. By how much it changed.
Yeah.
Depending on how far removed they were. Like you said, some of them were 27, 30 years later. Some of them were 4 years later. So the time that they spent away obviously multiplied the amount that they felt ostracized by this new society. Yep.
They're like, what did I just give 30 years of my life in a jungle for?
Now, I think it all points back, and I think it brings it into, what we're doing here today is just pointing out the ability for not only the American media, but the world's media organizations to manipulate the mind and get certain ideas pushed by either side. As long as they can concoct a good enough story, the American media can make a left-wing issue seem right-wing for the time being, vice versa, and can also make it seem like an American issue or a one-sided issue.
Right.
And that's the power that the media does have today still. Even though that they're losing all this power due to the grasp, they still, what's important for people to realize is even if people don't watch the mainstream news, everybody still talks about it. It's still what people formulate opinions on, and especially it still forms the opinions of our elites, of our policymakers.
That's true.
They make their policy decisions based on a Fox News or a CNN. They don't necessarily listen to podcasts.
No, that's
Nor
right.
do they want to. Nor do they want to expose themselves to that free-minded thinking, because it takes them out of their ability to actually function and be valuable. Right? If you're going to be valuable to your side in Congress right now, you are an extreme partisan. You are looked at.
That's right.
You are looked at as the scapegoat if you're that one Republican who votes in the middle. Sometimes is going to deny a Republican-led policy. Mm-hmm. Like you're looked at as
the rhino.
Yeah,
pretty much.
I think that's where we're at, and I think that's where it gets to a point where it is so much incumbent on us as Americans to push for people of not only third party, but people who maybe even they call themselves Republican, but like Donald Trump in his first time running, didn't really align with any real Republican
at the time
policies at the time.
Yeah.
And he changed them.
And then he rewrote the definition of what Republican was.
Mm-hmm.
It's certainly, I wouldn't call it liberal, even back then, but it was
definitely not conservative.
Different.
Definitely not conservative. I wouldn't call it that. It's something else. Call yourself an isolationist who's also going to spend a ton of money on the military and restrict trade to other nations. It does not follow any sort of contingency.
Well, the restricting trade with other nations, that certainly wasn't conservative.
I think that was all him. I think that was just him thinking that
big spending bills, certainly not conservative. Isolationism, maybe conservative.
You can make a point. But it was
military spending.
It was peace through strength, which I think is a type of conservatism we haven't seen.
Right. And that was refreshing to people, I think.
Yep. One of the things that I hope people, if you do go read that book that I mentioned earlier, The Myth of the Left and Right, one thing that I hope people would actually understand is that the use of the terms like liberal and conservative don't actually make any sense. The reason being is that liberals are looking at this point to conserve quite a lot. They're looking to conserve the institutions that they've created. They're looking to conserve the spending reforms that they've done. They're looking to conserve all the the civilian policy, like the race, the gender, the LGBTQ rights, this type of stuff, the abortion rights. There's a lot of stuff that they actually want to keep enshrined in law.
Right.
They're actually conserving. You can make an argument more nowadays than conservative.
Well, what they have, and that that's something I've been thinking about a lot actually too. With that, the reason, like you said, those two words, liberal and conservative, don't always mean that much, is because it depends on the context of when you're talking about.
Absolutely,
them, right?
Depends on the issue.
It seems like we're starting to turn the corner a little bit here, where liberals, like you said, are wanting to conserve some of this radical ideology in schools, for example.
Sure.
Where conservatives are wanting to, I guess, progress towards what things used to be like in their minds.
Right. And you could say that
being progressive,
conservative, or you could say that's progressive.
Yeah, there's two different ways of looking at it.
Yeah, that's what I want people to take away. And realistically, the ability for the media to manipulate that little bit of information. All they have to do is leave out a few words, and all of a sudden something sounds harsh and evil.
Right.
And they just have to add a wing, left or right, to it. And all of a sudden you're thinking one way or the other about it. It's as simple as that. People just understand that the more research that you do on your own, the better off you're going to be. You might not really like either side, and to me, I think that's okay.
Yep.
Anything else, Andrew?
Nope.
Everybody else, we'll catch you next week. I hope you enjoyed this one. I might actually get one out to you on Friday this week if me and Andrew decide to record another one right here. Until then,
Damn,
peace
I
out.
wish I were the fucking state. I wanna be something, not nothing. Trapped inside my dream and I'm running away from these demons. But the feeling's so good, I'ma keep dreaming.